Hey girls, gays, and days, and welcome back to another Queer and podcast episode. I'm your host, Nastasia, and I use she, her pronouns, and I am super excited to be talking about the topic of today's episode. But before we get into that, I have a few announcements. The first one is, as you can probably tell, I have a very, very different background from my previous podcast episodes, and that is because I am back home in the States. I was visiting family in Serbia for the summer, and I wasn't living at home, so it was a very different background. This background is very me, very appropriate for this podcast topics at hand. Yeah, has a lot more personality. Personally, I like it more, but that's just a humble flex because it's my room. um, for the most part, going forward, this is probably going to be the background of most episodes, but it can change because maybe I'll want it from a different angle of the room or whatever. Still figuring out logistics and stuff like that. But you can always give me feedback, of course. But yeah, just wanted to point that out so you're not like confused as to what's going on. So yeah. Now let's start talking about today's topic. Today's topic that I chose to talk about is heteronormativity, and specifically the harms of a heteronormative society. That's like such a long word. And kind of how it affects queer people, queer identities, but also how it affects straight cis people. Like, I have feelings that it's negative for both sides of sexualities and gender identities. So yeah, I'm just gonna get right into my talking points. So heteronormativity, if you're not aware, is basically society where cisgenderness and like heterosexuality is the norm. It's what's considered normal, it's what's always been, and that's the way that our society functions. It's very much heteronormative in the way that it's like reproduction in so that you can reproduce, and then obviously hello, but it's like, yeah, it's like reproducing and this and this and this so that you carry on more genes, and like it's kind of like, I don't know, but it's basically a lot of like how our system is set up, how our society is set up, and we still obviously hold on to that. It's kind of like, it's very different from the patriarchy, but it's kind of like the patriarchy in a way that they're both systems that affect us, and they're both systems that are still in society today, and it was how society was built, etc., etc., etc. But yeah, heteronormativity is basically just kind of like heteronorm. Like, it's kind of in the name. It's like hetero is the norm, and that becomes very harmful because it hurts queer people, it hurts queer identities, and it doesn't leave a lot of space for us in society and for us to be considered normal, to be considered also the norm, and to be kind of put on an equal pedestal. So yeah, I guess I want to start off with how heteronormativity also affects cis and straight people, because I think that that's something that's not talked about a lot when we talk about heteronormativity, because I mean, like, it makes sense, and it's probably not the first thing that would come to your head when like somebody mentions the negative aspects and the negative sides of heteronormativity, but I see a lot of negatives that people who the system is built for still suffer from. So I guess an example is that it's very much putting people in a box. It's very much reinforcing gender roles, reinforcing relationship roles. This is the man, and these are the specific roles in the relationship. you know, go to work, provide for family, blah, blah, blah. This is the woman in the relationship. These are her roles in the relationship, you know, have kids, take care of kids, da, 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 da. You know, it's like very black and white. There's no room for flexibility. There's not really much room for like, I mean, I guess now in society it's a little bit more, you know, tolerant and all of that, but I guess like it's still very much like holding on to those roles, which also kind of intersect with the roles coming from the patriarchy, right? Um, so we see some similarities there, but it's that, and then it's also kind of just you're putting people in a box, right? And when people are put in a box, and if they don't fit in to the box, whether that's because they're like it's like the other side, like they're not cis or not hetero, or it's just like the little things where they're like they can still be straight, but maybe they're polyamorous, or maybe like um I don't know, maybe they don't want a relationship that has specific gender roles attached to it, or you know, like they don't want to do this and this and this in relationships and whatever. So it's very rigid, and it's very much like like, you know, and there's not much room for flexibility and for each and everyone's personal choices when it comes to relationships and when it comes to who they are, identity, and all of that, which is obviously very harmful because putting cis people and putting hetero people into boxes isn't good either. Like, yeah, like they deserve to have the right to have a relationship that fits within what they want a relationship to look like, within their boundaries, within their interests, within whatever. Like, everyone has the right to have a relationship as long as it doesn't harm anyone. Like, if you want, as the man of the family, to stay at home with the kids, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's like heteronormativity is so against that. It's against it because that's not the norm. That's not how it was way back when, you know? It's like, and it holds on to those norms that came with how society was built, and that came with all of this and da da da. And so whenever you try shying away from it, even in like the slightest ways possible, it does not want that, because that, like, it's not good for people who want the system intact. So that's why there's like just, I feel like, always a lot of conversations about that. But yeah, I guess that's kind of a brief of how it affects hetero and cis people. That's not really the main focus of today, because is that ever really the main focus of anything in my podcasts? uh, but I think it's important to point out, because I think it's not something that's talked about and not something that's thought about a lot. But generally speaking, a bunch of these systems, even the patriarchy, still affects men negatively. It's not like these systems aren't really benefiting anyone except for the most elite and the most privileged and the most powerful, right? And unfortunately, because they are the most elite and the most privileged, they have the most power, which gives them the power to uphold such systems. So that's where we are today. But let's move on to, I guess, the longer part of this video, this episode, this topic, and that is how heteronormativity negatively affects queer people, queer identities, and anyone outside of the spectrum of cisgender and hetero. So yeah, I guess the first and obvious thing is that it's not considered the norm, and when you are not considered the norm, you kind of become a minority, right? And obviously we know that the LGBTQ plus community is already a minority, right? But if you're not given equity and you're not given equality, that generally affects how you act, how you feel, right? And it makes it a lot harder for you to like function and for you to find yourself, because functioning in a heteronormative society as a queer person is a lot more difficult. It's a lot more difficult to manage, and you have to work a lot harder to get your voice heard, and to, be put on some kind of equal pedestal with what has always been considered the norm and what has always been considered right and the only way and whatever, right? And our society today is still very heteronormative, even in the United States, even in the most leftist liberal countries ever. It's just how it is, because I think that when you're a minority, it's probably going to be a long, long, long time until you are considered the norm, even though it shouldn't be that way, obviously. But I think that even the most queer friendly places, heteronormativity is still intact everywhere. And I mean, that's kind of where I'm looking at it from, I guess. My thoughts on this topic are all over the place, which I feel like you can already tell, but I don't know. That's just how I feel. Um, like, that's why we have pride flags, right? And we have pride flags for specific identities. Like, we have the Progress Pride flag, which is just kind of, the universal one, but we have specific ones like asexual, bisexual, like, we have like for the more specific identities and labels, we have different pride flags, right? But we don't really have any for straight people because there has never been a need for them to have a flag because they have already had everything else given to them, right? This flag is a form of representation and a form of queer people being able to identify safe spaces and, being able to reclaim and take their power back on in such a heteronormative society. So I feel like even just talking about pride flags, right, which is such a minuscule thing, and it's not really like a whole, like, it's, I don't know, right? It's like not really something that you would typically talk about when talking about heteronormativity, but I think it's important to talk about because I think that it's like, it may seem obvious, but it's not always that obvious. Like, why do we have pride flags but not a straight flag? Or, and that's not to say that we don't, like, it's just, you're not given a straight flag because you don't need it. That's as simple as it is. And you don't see, for the most part, you don't see straight people advocating to have a straight flag because they don't need it. Right? And the pride flag is a symbol of hope and identity and something that's needed because as a minority group, you need to be able to identify safe spaces. You need to be able to, feel safe, feel like you can reclaim something, feel like you can be a part of something, right? And that's exactly what the community is for, and that's exactly what these flags are for, and all of these conversations are for. So that's one thing, I guess. It's kind of like, but I feel like it's relevant. And then another thing about heteronormativity is that it's very, I guess this makes sense. It's very traditional and it's very, let's still try and put you in a box. Even like you're already out of the norm, right? In our society, like you're already considered out of the norm, but we want to keep you in some kind of box still. So we're going to throw out labels. And I do want to clarify this before anything gets before I go further into this conversation. Labels work for a lot of people. For example, identifying yourself as a specific label within the LGBTQ plus community, like identifying yourself as asexual, aromantic, bisexual, pansexual, whatever the case may be, that works for a lot of people. A lot of people feel seen within those labels. They feel like it represents them and they identify with those labels. Hence why, it's part of someone's identity. However, labels also aren't for everyone within the queer community, and a lot of people within the queer community are unlabeled, or they're fluid and they have a lot of different labels, and we see this within even gender identity as well, not just sexuality. Like people within the trans spectrum, they may not be trans or non-binary, they can be gender fluid, or like they can be yeah, they can be gender fluid, and they can, you know, have fluidity within their gender, also within your sexuality. It's like these fluidity is allowed, and fluidity is okay. If that's how you feel, that's how you feel. But I feel like in a heteronormative society, especially, putting people into these boxes and putting people into these labels is like an easier way for people to wrap their heads around things and wrap their heads around identities, which is shitty because it shouldn't be about other people. It should be about you and how you feel. So a lot of people don't identify with labels. They don't feel like it works for them. There are a lot of people who, you know, may just feel a little bit out of specific labels. And that's fine. Like, it's okay to be unlabeled. It's okay to have fluidity. It's okay to experiment and to still be figuring things out. Like, that's normal. That's life. And how it hurts the queer community is when you try to put the queer community into boxes, you try to minimize the queer community in a way, and you try to minimize specific identities or fluidity within the community. And that makes it even harder for us as a community to flourish, and even harder for us as a community to get our voice out there, right? And I mean, I think for me, I guess a little personal aspect is I've always put some pressure on to label myself because I felt like I needed to do it. At first, when I was very, like, I started realizing things about myself when I was around 15. So I was still pretty young. I mean, I'm only 18 now, so it's like, but I was still pretty young, and I was still very much like, okay, this is how everyone else is doing it. This is everyone else's experience. So this has to be my experience. Like, I have to find a label that works for me. And I moved in around a few labels because I was still figuring myself out and my identity out, and that's completely normal and okay. But maybe if, you know, I was figuring myself out now, I probably maybe would have done it differently. Maybe I wouldn't have tried to box myself immediately. Maybe I wouldn't have had that pressure on me. And maybe it would have been a smoother experience. I don't know. Maybe it would have been the same. Maybe there would have been other things that made it hard. Whatever. But I do want to say that heteronormativity, putting queer people into boxes for their own benefit, harms us as a community as a whole, but it also harms certain individuals that may feel like they don't fit into certain labels, or they just don't want to label themselves. That's totally fine. It's not something that a lot of people want to, like, I guess in order to label yourself, I feel like it has to be something that you think about, and something that, you know, you really have to get in line with your thoughts and your feelings and who you are and how you like how you feel. And not everyone wants to do that. People just kind of want to live their lives and figure it out as they go, or like, you know, like, oh, if I happen, like, you're out at a social event and you happen to like the person of the same gender, like you happen to feel attraction for them, so great. But if you like, there's just people who don't feel the need to put themselves into labels. They feel fine, and that's completely okay and normal. But in heteronormative society, it's not. It's frowned upon because, once again, it's very much traditional, and it's very much reinforcing of everyone has a certain role. Everyone's in a certain box, and you have to do this and this and this and this and this and this and this. And being outside of that box, whether it's as a straight person or as a gay person, is frowned upon. Obviously, one is more frowned upon than the other, but it's still frowned upon. And another aspect of heteronormativity that irks me I need this part to be smashed, and I'm seeing it be debunked, and I'm seeing a lot of queer people talk about this, and I'm so glad because it's so important. Um, and that is the concept of coming out. This is kind of crazy because when I first heard it, I was like, what? Like, what do you mean? Like, the concept of coming out isn't for everyone. Like, what? That doesn't make any sense. Right? That's what I first thought when I heard of it. Because, again, you're in the queer community, you're being put into boxes, you're being put into labels, and there's a very specific guideline of how things should go. You should figure this out about yourself, and then this about yourself, and then you should tell these people, and da 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 da, right? It's very much like a list and black and white and like rigid, and this is exactly how it has to go for every single individual, but it's not the same for every single individual. It's different for every single individual. One way or another, we can find connections in our stories, in our experiences, in our identities, but each and every one of us still have had a different experience in our shared experience, right? Am I making sense? I feel like that makes sense in my head, but I don't know if it makes sense in your head. Let me know. But yeah, the concept of coming out is something that has always been forced upon queer people. It's always been the norm to, as a queer person, come out, right? And I hate that. I hate the aspect of coming out because I feel like oftentimes it's a bigger deal than I want it to be. For me personally, once again, same thing with what I said with labels. Coming out works for a lot of people. A lot of people feel like it's an important part of their journey, it's an important part of their identity, and they want people to know, they want to tell specific people, and they have a certain way that they want to tell specific people. That's great. Coming out works for you. It works for you. Totally fine. But there are also a lot of people within the queer community that don't feel like they need to come out. They don't have a need for it. They don't want to. And that's completely valid as well. Me personally, not a big fan, truly. If you know me, I haven't really had many coming out moments where it's like the typical coming out moment of like, I'm sitting down with this person, I'm telling them who I am and this and this and this and this. My experiences have just kind of been like, I've had, I guess, 3, and the first one was me telling my friends like, hey, pretty sure this is who I am, letting you know. That's pretty much it. Like, just throwing it out there, which is a form of coming out because it's still, informing a person about it, but it's a lot more laid back. And then second one was kind of just being like confirming it, which I don't really know if I would consider coming out or not, because it's not really like I'm telling the person, it's more of like they're asking me and I'm saying yeah. And then the third was just people would figure it out and it would become common knowledge and I would talk about it a lot, right? I feel like being gay is my whole personality, but like for fucking real. Like I talk about it all the time. I think it's a very important part of my identity, but there are a lot of people, most people within the queer community that feel quite the opposite of me. They don't like making it a huge part of who they are. They don't like talking about it. They don't like talking about it all the time. It's part of who they are. It's part of their identity. That's kind of it. They like keeping it to themselves, or people know about it, but it's not something that's talked about all the time, and they don't really feel that way. And that's fucking fine. That's fucking great. Like, that's amazing. But I've always been a person who's very opinionated and very loud about the things that I like and the things that I don't like. And that's just how I've always been. So obviously I'm here with the fucking queer podcast and it's all I ever talk about. And that's fine if that's how I feel the most comfortable within my identity, then that's fine. That's how I feel the most comfortable with it. And it's not, I'm not living for somebody else. I'm not, my experiences are not for anyone else. They're for me. If this is how I identify myself and I express myself and my identity and how I feel comfortable, then that's fine. The other ways are fine as well. However, the whole concept of coming out, to me personally, is so outdated especially because there were always very rigid rules of coming out as well. It wasn't just, hey, let a person know you're whatever you identify as. It's, hey, let a person know that you're this, and you sit them down, and it's a very serious conversation, and it's like all of this. At least that's how it's been represented to us for the longest time when it first started being represented to us, because it wasn't always represented to us, as we know with just queer representation in general. But it's always been like, hey, I'm sitting you down and I'm having a serious conversation with you, and I'm telling you this and this and this, and you either take it well or you don't, right? No, I hate that. That sounds like my worst conversation. That sounds like my worst nightmare. I would hate to have a conversation like that to someone, anyone. Yeah, no. My coming out experience in general wasn't like that. It was very chill. I was just like, gay, that's it. Like, let it be known. That's kind of like, that's just what I was about. I wasn't, and I personally still have a lot of people who don't know. It's very much in the air. A lot of people assume, a lot of people know, and they don't even have to ask because it's like an obvious thing, and it's like, duh. But I've never come out to someone. I've never had a sit down conversation with this person that I'm telling, hey, I'm gay, because I don't like that. It doesn't feel like something that's important to me. It doesn't feel like it's something that I would benefit from. It feels very forced, at least for me, because that's generally not how I have conversations with people. You can tell I'm having a conversation right now for my podcast in the most informal way possible, right? I'm not just sitting down very serious and talking to you. That's not who I am. And when the expectations of coming out are that way, it's very weird because I've never felt the need to have it be like that. I actually prefer, I mean, a lot of people know that I'm gay because, hello, it's all I talk about, and also it's very obvious, and I mention it like a lot, right? It'll just pop up in conversations, right? And it's the same way as it'll pop up in fucking straight conversations. But that's for another section of this. Okay. But for me, I've always just felt like coming out is not necessary. Most of my family doesn't know. I've never come out to anyone in my family, really. Like, if people know, it's because they know, they figured it out, they're not oblivious, right? But I've never really ever told anyone from my family, and most of my family, it's still very much like, what are you? Who are you? And I like it. I love it that way because there's no judgment. Nobody knows really. There's no awkwardness, no feeling different about me. And the one thing, at least for me, with coming out, that I've noticed that I really dislike is the whole awkwardness and the whole, this is so serious and I'm gonna let you know this in the most serious way possible. Because it's not that serious. For me, at least. That's how I feel. Yes, I'm gay. Yes, that's something that is part of my identity, and it's something that I talk about a lot, and it's something that's important to me. But that's different from something that's serious, right? It's not a serious thing. It's something that I have going on with my life. It's like, if I had blue colored hair, that's not something serious. I wouldn't sit you down for it, right? And be like, hey, I have blue hair, like, like, no, I wouldn't do that. And that's not something that's expected of people to do, because it's like, okay, yeah, you have, like, what? Like, and that's how I feel personally about my sexuality. It's not that I don't want people knowing. It's quite the opposite. I love people knowing, and I often like people know and very open about it. but I don't want it to be such a serious conversation and such a serious matter, because it's not like that to me. It's completely normal to me. It's how I've felt my entire life. It's how I've lived my entire adolescence, and how I've known of myself, right? And doesn't change who I am, doesn't change anything about me. And I feel like with coming out, it makes such a big deal out of something, and that's great. That's fine if you want to have a huge coming out party, if you want it to be a big deal because it's a huge part of you and you feel like you want that. That's great, but that's not how a lot of people feel, and that's not how I feel, and I do not want that. Do I want a gay party? Fuck yeah. Like, I would love a party with like pride flags, and I would love that. Like, I live for that. But I don't want necessarily a coming out party, because I don't think of my identity that way. I don't think of it as anything different. I don't think of it as something that I am obligated to inform you of. Because I'm not. And that's the part of heteronormativity. It's like coming out is an obligation that has been expected for years, decades of queer people, right? That, hey, if you're queer in any way within that spectrum, you have to let people know. Even before you get into like serious relationships with them, like even before you get to know the person, like you should let people know. But it's like, no, you shouldn't. You don't have to let anyone know anything ever. Like, it's not anyone's business. You can let people know because you want to, because why the fuck not, right? But it's like, you don't. Nobody needs to know. That's your business. That's who you are. And that's like, coming out is like, it's a stupid concept because it's so rigid, and it's because it's so forced, and it's like, this is how it needs to go. This is who you need to tell. This is how you need to tell people. This is like, and make sure that you're always coming out. And like, it's like it's like, I need to take a breath from all of this, because it's so crazy that even when I think about it, it's like, technically, throughout my entire life, I would be coming out for like all day, every day. Like, whenever I meet someone, it's kind of like a moment that it's like, hey, by the way, I'm gay. Like, like, in one way or another, we're always coming out, but because the enforcement and the need for coming out comes from the ties to heteronormativity of gay is not, or not gay, queerness is not the norm. It's not what people assume of you. And because people automatically assume that you are straight and or cisgender, your process of coming out to them in a heteronormative society, in a heteronormative way, is informing them that you are not what they have assumed you are. But it's like, why am I fixing your assumption? You shouldn't have assumed that in the first place. And that is where my point comes in. If we weren't living in a heteronormative society, coming out wouldn't even exist as a concept, because you wouldn't have assumed anything to begin with, right? You wouldn't have labeled straight or cis as the norm. It would have been in the open. It would have been, hey, everyone's like, everything's normal, like, it's whatever, like, and people, like, yeah, people can let you know, like, hey, this is what I am, blah, blah, blah. But that's like normal conversation, like getting to know a person. That's how it happens. Right? Like, but coming out in a heteronormative society is very different, because you're, I guess, it's always assumed that you're straight or cis unless you specify otherwise. And it shouldn't be like that. Nothing should be assumed about your identity, period. Because you don't know someone's identity just based off of how they look, based off of who they are, where they were born, whatever. And if we weren't living in a heteronormative society, those assumptions wouldn't have existed in the first place. Coming out would have been a concept. This earth would be a much lovelier, more accepting place, and It would have been brilliant. I would have loved it. I would have lived for it. But unfortunately, that's not the case, and that's harmful. It's hurtful and it's harmful when it's reinforced, because queer people and people who identify some way with the queer community are always working twice as hard, because they're always engraved with this assumption that they aren't what they are, right? And it's also, if we weren't living in a heteronormative society, internalized homophobia, internalized transphobia wouldn't also be a thing, because there wouldn't be anything to internalize, because there wouldn't have been a norm to begin with, right? When you are different than the norm, right? Like growing up gay, it's different than the norm in a heteronormative society, right? And because of that, you get internalized homophobia, and you get these aspects of, you know, that you've picked up from a heteronormative society. And then you have to debunk that, and then you have to, you know, expose that and get to your true identity and the core of who you are as a person, and la la la. But if we weren't in a heteronormative society, none of that would be the case, because there would be no, like, I'm straight, I'm gay, blah, blah, blah. It would just be like, this is who I am. And it wouldn't, like, I feel, at least in a heteronormative society, that I'm constantly being pulled down, constantly as a queer person, constantly being pulled down, because I've had to put in a lot of work in a heteronormative society. I've had to fit in certain roles and certain labels and certain boxes. And I've had to figure out things by myself, and I've had to do all of this when it's like, if heteronormativity was never a thing, I never would have gone through the experiences that I did with internalized homophobia, religious trauma, any of that, because none of that there would be no pressure from me to fit into this norm, because it wouldn't have been there in the first place. Is this making sense? Like, I feel like I hope you're grasping the concept and what I'm trying to say here. But yeah, I think the biggest harm of heteronormativity is that queer people cannot truly 100% flourish under an oppressive heteronormative society. It's a society that wasn't built for us. It's a society that isn't very validating to most of our identities. It's a society that wants to label us, wants to box us, and it's not a society that does any good. Same with a patriarchal society, right? It doesn't benefit anyone, essentially, except for, obviously, like I said, the most elite, the most powerful, and the most privileged. So those are my thoughts on heteronormativity, the harms of it. In terms of how we can smash that shit, is keep having conversations about it, keep sharing personal experiences, keep pushing away from it, because that's the only way. Even if it's little tiny steps. A million tiny steps are still a million steps. You know what I'm saying? Like, we'll get there eventually, and probably not in our lifetimes. But maybe one day there'll just be a society, and it won't be patriarchal or heteronormative, and people can just exist, and people can just be. And I hope that that's the ultimate goal. At least for me, I feel like that is my dream and my ultimate goal, and I would love that. That's not the case right now, and I think it's important to recognize the consequences that come with that, the harm that comes with that, especially for minority groups and people who fit outside of the norm and have to, feel that way their entire lives. So it's important to have these conversations. It's important to shed light on these issues and these experiences because, in a way, we're normalizing it. In a way, me just talking to you about my personal experiences, how I feel in a heteronormative society, is putting more normalization on my identity and my experience because, hey, that's one more person who may feel the same way as you, and that's one more aspect of a representation. And the more representation you get, the more normalized it is throughout. And yeah, I mean, I feel like that's kind of self-explanatory. It's like if you see more of something throughout society, it's like exposure, right? You're more exposed to it, so you're gonna be used to it. It's like if you live in a black and white world, right? And all of a sudden there's just color thrown at you, it's going to be very weird, it's going to be intense, it's going to be confusing. But if you live in a world where there's black and white and gray, and then there's, shades of blues and like all these like darker shades, and then it like slowly brightens, it's not going to be a shock. It's not gonna be a difference. There's not like it's not gonna have as much effect on you. So that's how I feel about heteronormative society, at least for me. It felt very black and white. That was my life. And then all of this color, but then it was all very confusing and very intense. But if it wasn't that way, then all of those emotions maybe wouldn't have been a part of my experience. But my experience is my experience, and I don't I don't I don't know. Don't have any regrets that that's how I experienced it. Would I, wish that things went differently? Yeah, from like an aspect of I was struggling and I felt shitty in a lot of ways, but that's just life, and that's just how it was for me, and that's okay. And I hope that that's, not something that is going to be as common, and who knows. But yeah, that's, I guess, my tangent on heteronormativity. My thoughts were all over the place, but my thoughts are kind of always all over the place. So, yeah, I just talk what I think, just how I function. That's who I am. And that's always been my podcast. It's always been very informal. It's always been more of a conversation and a lot of me sharing my thoughts and experiences more than me just sitting down and being very like, this is the first agenda item, then this, and then this, because that's just not who I am as a person. That's just not how I function. If you're into that kind of podcast, you're into that kind of thing, that's great. It's probably not for you then, but yeah, I don't know. That's all I have to say. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sticking through me. I know it was crazy. It was wild. It's always like that, and that's why I love you guys, because you guys, we're in it together through thick and thin. Okay. So yeah, I will see you next Friday, and I have no idea what the topic is. So if you have any suggestions, comment them below. I'll probably do a poll on Instagram. Make sure you're following my socials. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you so much, and see you next week.